Today's video is a very fun one where we're going to take a different medium, watercolor, and create some very simple images that you can use to make cards or bookmarks or even something to tuck into your journal. Watercolor is a very interesting medium. It has a mind of its own, it likes to do its own thing, and it can be frustrating to learn. But if you can take it step by step and start with some basics like wet on wet, and then letting layers dry and building them up, you'll have great success, and you'll also get a beautiful image. So let's get started.
So watercolor is a beautiful art, and it doesn't have to be complex. In fact, I find some of the simplest illustrations are just the most beautiful. So for watercolor, I love to use that in my journals. I prefer to paint on the paper directly with an acrylic paint because the watercolor requires a good heavy paper to really paint on because it will warp the paper. But I do like using the images in my work. So I'll make my image and then I'll scan it onto regular copy paper and cut it out. But I wanted to show you just some of these beautiful images. In today's video, we'll be starting out very simple, just making some of these candy corn. But in my classes that I teach elsewhere, and I have the links in the comments, we created these illustrations here of Halloween gnomes dressed in costume, of the classic costumes, Frankenstein, a mummy, and a witch. And for my members, I have a video on creating that devil. There's also that little ghost too. But for today's video, we're gonna go back to these candy corn. Now, I think they're great because here's how I use them in my journal. I printed out the candy corn because I scanned it in. I was able to put lots of images on one piece of paper, and then I just attached it here. And then I have an enlarged piece here of the candy corn. I also use the image here for my little devil to put in the pocket. And that's how I use it in my junk journals. It makes it very personal to me. It's easy enough to do, and it can be intimidating to start. And that's why I think we'll start with something so simple, just like this, the candy corn. It's a simple shape and it's easy enough to trace. So there's lots to get started with watercolor, but you don't need a lot of supplies. The one thing to invest your money in is your watercolor paper. It's not highly expensive, but you don't want to get a lightweight paper. You want to look for at least 140 pound or 300 grams. And this makes the paper, it's the weight of the paper, and it makes the paper a little more thick. If you want to create a larger project or more detailed work, I'd suggest even going higher with your watercolor paper count and getting cotton paper. But to make very quality images, the 300 gram is a really good number. It holds up to water and it doesn't tend to warp as much. If you just use copy paper or cardstock, it's not worth your time. It'll destroy the image on the paper. Now for the gnomes, I have a template if you want to download it for anybody who's willing. I have the candy corn that we're going to make today, and I'll show you how to modify the template. But if you go to the template to download it, which you're welcome to, you'll get these images as well in case you want to practice with them. But to use the template, you'll need a light source. You print out your template here, or use it on your screen and put your watercolor paper on top of the screen so that the light comes from behind. To do that, I'm going to show you it on this little light pad here. It illuminates from behind, and if I put my image down and shut off my studio lights, then I can start to see the image if I want to trace it. Of course, you can do these drawings freehand as well. So let's start with the candy corn. We'll start with the lesson. We'll just jump right in. I like to use a waterproof permanent marker. You don't need to use a marker. You can just use a pencil and erase your lines. But for this image, it's very much what I consider a journal image. I like that crisp outline. So I just take the marker, find my image that I want to trace, whether it's the gnome itself or the candy corn, and then I'll just trace around it. You can decide if you want these lines to be solid or if you want to dash them. And then I create the lines here. Now this image has two candy corns, so there's one behind it. So that's how I create that. Now, if I want to modify it, I can flip my template over to get a slightly different angle and variation. This is a very simple image. So depending on the image, you'll get a different effect. The gnomes, if you were to reverse the paper, would be pointing in a different direction. And if I wanted to combine images, so I'll come here, flip this over one more time, and let's see, maybe I want to have a pile of candy corn. So I'll have this here, top one here, and because I like odd numbers, I want one more piece of candy corn. Maybe just pointing out this way at a slight angle. So now you can either trace your image or draw it freehand. So then you have your image. The next thing to consider is the paint. Now you can buy a Crayola tin of watercolor paint, and for practice, that's totally fine. They're usually dried paint. I tend to use tube paint with my work, but it's not required. They make some very high quality dried paint as well. This is a brand named Koi, and I sometimes use other brands depending on the colors that I want. You can also find the dried color, as I was saying, the pans. This one's a travel set that I frequently use, and I really like this because all the colors are dried, nothing's leaking, and I can use a water pen with it. And this one is a little more costly, has all the colors here, and then on the top of the cover, it's the actual color, so if I need to replace it, I know which to replace. But let me show you how I use the tubes. They're very easy, especially when I want to use something as simple as just a few colors for the candy corn. So for my colors, I decided I want to do the candy corn in the traditional colors, which are white at the top, orange, and then a yellow base. So to do that, I chose reds, orange, and yellows because I don't want a single color. You don't need to use all these colors. You can just use a yellow and an orange, but I like to use the red with the orange. It's a darker version. And then I have two yellows here, a lemon yellow and a deep yellow. Now the lemon yellow tends to be cool. It looks more green than orange. And my deep yellow looks a little more orange than green. And then I have two other colors. You can just use the colors on whatever watercolor palette you have. Now for the white top, watercolor has white paint, but it doesn't really show up on your white paper. I like to use just a little shadow, a hint of a blue, very, very little. Now to color just these few pieces of candy corn, we don't need very much paint. So I'll fill my palette. I'm going to start here with this cerulean blue. It's a light blue, and I don't need very much because I'm just using a hint of color. I have a very small amount of pigment. And I'll do the same thing with my colors, grouping them together. So I like to start with my darker color. This is a carmine red, but red comes in various colors, and that's a lot more pigment than I'll need. And then this is a vermilion hue. And again, I'm squeezing out very much. The beauty of watercolor is when it dries, I can reactivate it by just re-wetting it. So I don't have to lose whatever's on my palette. It's not like acrylic paint that once it dries, its working life is done. And I have my deeper yellow and my lemon yellow. So the next thing with watercolor is water. You'll want lots of clean water, and you might want to clean your jug of water throughout the process. You can use a water brush as well. I prefer the old school feel of using brushes, and I like brushes that come to a point. I'm only going to use two brushes for these. This one is a 6, has a nice pointed tip, and this one is a number 1. You can tell the numbers because they're on the handle. This one has been worn off. So you just get the feel of what brushes you like. I also like to have a paper towel handy because I can dry my brush or even dab my image when I'm done with it. So I'm going to start with these 2 candy corn. So I have my brushes and I have a little brush holder that I just prop the brushes on when I'm not using them. I'm going to start with my large brush, my number 6 brush. I'll dip it in water and then I dab it on my palette just to control the water. If it beads up along the side, I'll just gently swirl it around to clean it up. And I want to treat each section individually here of the candy corn. I'm going to start right in the middle. And so I'm just going to take my brush and wet a little bit of the paper with clear water in this middle section. You can see somewhat of a glare on the screen. From here, I want to take my lightest color. So this is a orange section. I'm going to add a little bit of water to all of my pigments, not touching the brush to them, just getting them wet. And I can re-wet them if they dry. It's not crucial that I do this until I use them. But I'm going to just dab until I get the consistency and the strength that I want. Now, if I continue to dab, I'll show you over here, I can really get this really thick. But I don't really want that. I want it to flow, be a little less vibrant, shall we say, because I can always go back and add more layers. I'm just going to take this, and I did not color all the way around that section. I colored just the middle with that clear water. And I'm just going to gently dab my pigment. Now, the beauty of watercolor is you don't want to color it in completely like a coloring book. If you do like that effect, then go ahead and do that. But for the most part, the beauty of watercolor is that the water on the paper, one of the techniques is that the water on the paper, the wetness, moves the pigment. It's called wet on wet. I'm gonna rinse my brush, and I always test it out to make sure it's clear again. And then I can just really emphasize the edge. And as you can see, wherever that water went, it interacted with the pigment that was down on the paper. Now, it's not a perfectly flat image. The watercolor has a little more intensity over here, a little more muted here, and that's kind of the look that I'm going for. I'm going to take my smaller brush now. Again, I'm going to dip it back in that pigment and really emphasize one side of each of these candy corn. Now, the 2 colors bled together because the water went over the boundary of both sides. I can leave it like that, or I can take my paper towel and I wrap it around my finger to get a little more control, and I'll just dab it, trying to pick up that color. I'll come back with my brush. This is just clear water on this brush, and I'm just blending out that main candy corn. Then I'll dab my brush somewhat dry, pick up that pigment again, and go in here and just trying to create a little bit of difference between the 2 candy corn. Again, I bled a little over there, so I'll just take a dry brush this time, pick up that pigment. And I seem to be making more of a mess, so I just try to relax, take my paper towel, and press it down. A lot of this is trial and error, and just experience of knowing that I rushed it or I crossed the boundaries with my water. And that's okay too. This is starting to dry. You can see that it's still glossy. So I'm going to come down here to my yellow section. I'm going to use my smaller brush, and again with clear water, I'm just going to brush on the inside section here. Now it's very wet. I'm going to come in here with a little of that lemon yellow, that lighter color, and just add a little pigment, let the water do its thing. I'm trying not to make a straight edge. I don't want there to be a perfect rectangle there. I want a hint of color, and then I can come back in and add a little more color. And then I'll take a little more of that deeper yellow, that yellow orange, and just drop it on the side there. This will give me a little variation. And then while this is still wet, I can carefully work on the top piece because I want it to look like white candy corn. I'm gonna go with blue, but you can use other colors. You can use purples or even a pink, grays. I'm just gonna wet the area very lightly, making sure that I'm careful not to get into that orange area. And then I want a very subtle blue color. So we'll take a little of this blue on this section, add some clean water, just until it's very light. And I can just put a little hint of pigment. Now, watercolor, when it dries, it will dry lighter than it appears here. So we'll let this dry, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, or you can speed this up with a hairdryer at a distance. And we'll see what happens with this, if we want to add more vibrancy or more layers. Okay, this has had a chance to dry. You can see just a little glare there that's wet, but most of this is dry, and you can see that the color is far more muted. I want to create even more vibrancy. You can leave it like this if you like, but I want to go a little further. And I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. I'm going to take a little more of this blue just to get it just slightly more intense. And now I'm doing a wet on dry, which means my brush is wet, but my paper where I'm putting that pigment is dry. So I created the shadow for the white part of the candy corn, and I'll just let that absorb into the paper and dry. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the orange part. I'm going to start with the orange again, and I'm not going to go over everything that I did, just creating a different shape, almost like an L shape. And on this one, I just want to go in the area where there would be a shadow from the top candy corn on the lower candy corn. I'm still doing the wet on dry, and because of that, I'm getting a straight edge here. So I'm going to take my brush and wet it with clear water and just dab it. And then I'm just going to whisk that color just to blend it a little bit. I'll dip my brush in the water again and just encourage the pigments to run and do their thing. I'll take a little bit of the red and I'm going to mix it in with that orange. It changes the tone of that orange, and I'll just dab that in, just in a few places. And that's that variation that we like. And now I want to work on the yellow, but I want to make sure that my brush is perfectly clear. I'm going to come back in with that lemon yellow, doing a layer on both. And I do like to see white of the paper. Then I'll rinse my brush again, clean off any drips, and go in with that deeper yellow. And so therefore, I've colored in those candy corn. I think it looks pretty great. So now I'm going to completely color in these, and I'll show you the process using the same colors. I'll speed it along and talk you through what I'm doing. I'm going to start with my number 6 brush. I'm going to start here working all of the tops of the candy corn first. This will be that blue area that we use, where we take some of that blue just to make a little bit of a shadow. And I'm going to go in the areas where there might be a little more shadow coming from the candy corn on top of them. The areas that don't have a candy corn on top of, I'll still add a little color just so it looks different. I don't want the stark white of the paper showing. Then I'll do the same thing, but I'm going to jump right now to the bottom, to the yellow section of each of these candy corn. Again, I start by going in with clear water on the brush. Then I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and that lighter color first. I like to focus on one side of the candy corn. In this case, on the right hand side is where I add most of my pigment, and I kind of just let it blend out to the left. Come back in with some of that deep yellow, letting it blend out. And then I want this layer to dry before I start working on my orange layer. So now when that's dry enough, I'll come in here, just add some water to the orange section of the candy corn, and then start layering. If I don't like how the area blended out, if it dried too much or made too much of a shape that I'm not happy with, I'll just go in there and coax it along with my brush. I don't want to overwork the paper because it can tear, but I can also play around with it somewhat. And then lastly, I'll come in with that darker color and just dab it in spots. While I'm here, I want to build up those layers. I'm going to go with the darker yellow, really playing around, and then I'll do the same with the blue. Just a little bit of intensity in certain spots really opens it up, makes it very fun. Now, one thing I like to do, which is optional, is to add a little bit of a cast shadow, but I want it to be subtle. I can use the blue again, like I have here, but I'm going to add just a tinge of red to that. So I'm going to mix up my blue, start another palette just so I can go back in and alter it, add a little bit of water to that, and then just take a tiny bit of this red and mix it in. And it starts to make the blue a little cooler until I get the effect that I like. That's a nice purple. And then I'll just come over here and just echo the shape. And that's how you create a very simple watercolor image to use in your junk journal or your artwork. Now from here, you can scan it into your computer once it's dried and digitally alter it, or you can just cut it up with a pair of scissors, making a tag or fussy cutting around it to have this very personal, unique, and handmade image.
So that's how I make watercolor candy corn. Watercolor is a fun image, and if you start with some basics, like wet on wet with simple drawings, well, you get great results. If you're ready to graduate further, be sure to get the download and check out the gnomes. You can have fun with those as well. For my members, I have a video on creating that devil gnome, but it's not necessary. And if you're interested in learning about all the gnomes, well, go to my Skillshare channel. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.